Hi. Thank you to everyone joining the webinar. I'm going to wait about another 15 seconds to allow more folks to enter the room before I give any welcome remarks and introductions. Okay, well, why don't we get started? Welcome, everyone, to today's discussion, The Role of Unions in Elections and Democracy, hosted by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation and the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. The Ash Center is obviously at Harvard's Kennedy School, and the Center for Labor and a Just Economy is part of Harvard Law School. My name's Sharon Block, and I'm a professor of practice at the law school and executive director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. I'll begin with a few announcements before I introduce our panelists. So first, we acknowledge the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Today's discussion is being recorded. You'll receive a link to that recording in an email following the conclusion of the event. You'll also be able to find it on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. We're going to reserve about 15 minutes to respond to questions from you, the audience. You can submit questions anytime, though, during the event via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So clearly, this could not be a more timely topic as we hold this event a mere 4 days before Election Day. It's been a lot of discussion during this election cycle in the media about union endorsements of presidential candidates, some about non-endorsements, about how union members are going to vote, and other topics that focus on what happens on Election Day and how unions impact the outcome of elections. And those are really important issues, and we'll talk some about that. But we also want to take one step back and have this panel also focus on more fundamental questions. What is the relationship between the labor movement and the project of democracy? I just say it's still unbelievable to me, but that question is very much on the minds of the public in this season. Like, what are our core commitments in this country to democracy, and what role does labor play in that? So I am thrilled to have just great people here with us to dig into these questions and explore this topic. So first we have Caitlin Fishman, Political Director, Service Employees International Union. Jake Grumbach, Associate Professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, and Jessica Tang, President of American Federation of Teachers, Massachusetts. So finally, as we're coming up on Election Day in the US, we'd like to remind those who are eligible to vote to make a voting plan. We also want to take this opportunity to let the Harvard community members know about the Harvard Votes Challenge, a nonpartisan initiative striving to build a civic culture here at Harvard by increasing voter registration and participation across the entire community. We invite all participants to learn more at voteschallenge.harvard.edu. So in lieu of individual remarks, I'm going to ask each of the panelists a few questions before we get into your audience questions. So Caitlin, I'm going to start with you. And again, thank you so much for being with us. This can only be an incredibly busy time at SEIU. So considering we're just a few days away from Election Day, I think I have to start by asking you about what SEIU has been doing in this cycle in relation to the election. And I'd love if you could talk a little bit about not just what is the election doing in these final days, but like what has been the arc of the union's engagement with the electoral process this time around. So I'm interested in like, when did you start talking to members about the election? Was it before the union even issued its endorsement? How did these communications change over time? Those kinds of questions.
Yes, thank you so much for that question, and thank you for having me. Great to be with you all in this very busy time. Yeah, I mean, in politics, we say that you need to have year-round conversations with voters to really have an impact on the election. And the same is true for how we talk with our members. And so really we started our work on this election in like January of 2023. Right. And in all through last year, we're talking to our members and to our communities around not only about the issues that they have, and at this point, the election isn't even on their minds, right? The issues that they care about right now that they want elected officials to deliver on, but also what the impact of their vote in 2022 was, right? What benefits have they been seeing and receiving as a result of them voting in 2022? And so you can name things like the Minnesota Miracle in Minnesota, or the litany of amazing pro-union policy that passed in Michigan, repealing right to work, and for us, some home care organizing initiatives that we really had been working hard on. And so really wanting to have, a conversation just around issues last year. And then also listening to our members. So we kicked off a series of roundtables across the country last year to talk to our members around issues they cared about, what they thought solutions to their problems were, and what they wanted candidates to deliver on. And that helped not only inform how we think about the election, but also our strategy. Because we always say we want our members to lead our political work, which also means we want them to lead our strategy. And so, around the country, we heard members talking about high prices, low wages, and we asked them, who do they think is to blame for this, right? Like how did we get into this place? And really, they said corporations, right? That the fact that corporations were getting off scot-free, not paying their fair share was creating an inequity, and that's what they wanted candidates to deliver on. And you can see, in Kamala Harris's speeches of what she said and the issues of this election, that it really is around the economy. It is around wages. It is around prices. And that's what we started talking about. And so it was, these issue conversations we had last year where when we got into 2024 and around the late spring, early summer, we started connecting candidates to the issue agenda that our members laid out in front of us to say, here's the demands that you want to see, and here are the candidates that are coming up and agreeing with our demands. And then obviously in this election, there were some curveballs that happened in the summer and everything turned on its head. And we had to have real conversations around who the candidates were and who was the best candidates for our union and for workers. And I'd say about late summers when we kicked into high gear, and we have thousands of members volunteering across the country every weekend. We have about over 1,000 members knocking on doors every day, full time, to talk to members and to talk to their community around what's at stake in this election. And in what's at stake in this election for us and for the country as we see it is really critical in terms of how we can close the economic gap, advance our freedoms and our ability to organize, for workers to have a voice in benefits and wages, and the ability to make decisions for our own bodies. And that's what we're talking to voters about now.
Right. So Jessica, again, same to you. Thank you so much for taking time out of what's, I'm sure, an incredibly busy time to join us today. So I sort of have the same question for you, but I'm curious how your union's engagement differs from what Caitlin described in light of the fact, at least according to polls, your members live in a state without a highly contested president or race for the state's electoral college votes, or even the Senate race seems to not be highly contested. So what kind of mobilization, what are the conversations you have with your members this cycle?
Sure. So we actually at AFT nationally definitely have a very similar trajectory to what Caitlin was sharing. In fact, we do a lot of partnership work and a lot of the get out the vote efforts. But for states like Massachusetts and New York, well, I should say even blue states do have contested down ballot races where we do have to put a lot of energy and effort into getting out the vote and educating and also hearing from our members as well. But in Massachusetts, because we don't have a lot of particularly competitive races, our challenge has really been to say, to our members that actually we have a big role to play still. I mean, we have, 65,000 members in swing states. And while we have a lot more members in Massachusetts, we have fewer members actually in New Hampshire, because our largest locals actually are in Massachusetts. And so we have a really important role to help out with our swing states as well. And so it's actually a lot of the same things that I think just on a more local level that Caitlin was talking about, because in engaging our members and activating them to become electorally or politically involved is still a whole effort. It doesn't just happen, right? And so we have to be on the ground too, visiting locals and helping our local leaders make the case for why we can't just stand on the sidelines in a blue state. And I'll be honest too, that we also had a lot of conversations with some of our members who didn't necessarily support Harris Walz as our endorsed candidate. And those conversations still need to happen in between elections because there is so much misinformation and disinformation out there. I've been at standouts where I have run into some of our AFT Mass members who are like, oh, I'm not sure if I can vote for Harris Walz. And, again, I'm not concerned that Harris Walz is not going to win the electoral votes in Massachusetts. But when we have members who have, erroneous information about, Biden and Harris's economic plan, for example, it tells us something about the education and information that we need to be sharing out. And that also does help us when we are going to New Hampshire. And we've been throughout the last few months in New Hampshire every weekend, helping out our affiliates in New Hampshire and the New Hampshire AFL-CIO. And then we have, we've had dozens of folks over the last few weeks actually go down to Pennsylvania, which has been, a critical swing state. And again, getting members though to get on those phone banks and to go out to New Hampshire or Pennsylvania or other places where we're needed is not something that just happens by itself. It's definitely a coordinated effort and push that takes a lot of energy and creativity also. And like, how do we activate and engage our members? How do we let them know that they actually do have an extremely important role to play, even in a quote unquote safe state like Massachusetts?
Super interesting. Thank you so much. All right, Jay, now that we've gotten our 2024 election cycle fix, I want to pull back and sort of ask a more general question about a topic you've certainly written a lot about, and that's how and why are unions essential for a healthy democracy?
Thanks for that question. And yeah, great to be on this webinar with real practitioners too. I just get to come in and nerd out. So it's always a nice feeling, but it's true. So typically, I mean, the conventional wisdom is the labor movement and organized labor is about sort of hard hat, guys, wages and benefits, maybe some effects on overall economic inequality, help to build the American middle class and so forth. But in general, around the world and in the US, labor has really been central to democratization of societies. So in the US, like the original founding, in the 18th century was prior to modern unions, but around the world in the 19th century, many sort of democratic revolutions were centrally about labor. And it sort of speaks to the role that organized labor is about many workers coming together in a collective voice. And typically that means labor and labor leaders and workers might see democratic institutions like voting rights for all, one person, one vote, and political equality in constitutional and democratic institutions. That's really helpful for unions and for the labor movement because they rely on these mass memberships, right? Rather people power rather than other forms of power. So in the modern era, we've seen, both in the 20th century that labor unions and untold history were very central to the civil rights movement that ended Jim Crow and mass disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the South, which through enforcement of the Voting Rights Act really made the US a democracy for the first time. And we don't realize that the Birmingham marchers themselves were bailed out by, for example, the United Auto Workers in the early 1960s. And then in the contemporary period, we can look at the different sort of effects that labor unions at different times and different contexts have. And I think Jessica was so on point. Labor unions have diverse memberships in all dimensions. Rank and file have all types of political ideologies, social identities. Unions are in different sectors and industries and have different incentives. Union leadership can really differ in their which sort of politicians or political coalitions they think aligning with will be for the benefit of their members and their unions in the short or long term. But in general, unions probably have effects on attitudes and identity within politics. So particularly in the era of the hyperculture war right now, it's helpful to connect workers to public policy rather than sort of culture war, scorched earth issues, and connecting people with public policy that might help material bases, creating identities as a worker rather than identities that might conflict, particularly if you're at the top of a race or gender hierarchy, having an identity additionally as a worker. Of course, Jessica and Caitlin mentioned GOTV, that you take existing rank and file, help craft organizers with get out the vote organizing, among many other forms of organizing. So there's this sort of effects on the workers themselves and that sort of attitudinal and activism that workers do. But then there are also these sort of more elite and organizational and money-based mechanisms that organized labor does too, that are really crucial for democracy. So usually we think of like money in politics as bad for democracy, and for the most part it really is. But unions also, like in the civil rights movement, bailing out marchers in Birmingham, Alabama, or more currently spending money on political education and socialization, spending money across labor locals in this federated way to move money towards, for example, swing states for within elections. And also just we see that when labor unions are weakened, it sends a sort of signal about the organizational balance of power going on, and coalitions that see that themselves having an interest in narrowing sort of democratic inputs, narrowing voting rights, or drawing legislative districts that are more biased in favor of one party, do tend to, we find in research, tend to get more aggressive as they succeed in weakening labor. So labor across the board, it depends again on leadership in particular moments. It depends on which type of unions we're talking about, which geographies. These things have different effects, but unions have sort of effects on worker attitudes and socialization. They increase participation, and they have these sort of organizational balance of power mechanisms in shaping democratic institutions, which I'm sure we'll get into more of the granular details later in this webinar.
Yeah, wow, it gives us a lot to think about. So I want to turn to Jessica and Caitlin and maybe get a little more like concrete about how you see your union's roles in filling some of these functions and objectives that Jake talked about. I mean, I think it's really interesting, that concept of like identity formation as workers. Like people come into the voting booth with lots of different identities. So what do you do to help or encourage your members to bring that worker identity with them into the voting booth? I mean, let's start there. I think Jake gave us a lot to think about.
Sure.
Oh, Jessica, yeah, go.
Yeah, or no, Caitlin, you could feel free to start. I mean, I think that identity as a union member and a worker is very much, I think, intertwined with just the work of a union in general in terms of helping us to exercise democratic muscles, right? Because getting to the voting booth in first place, again, is not something that everyone naturally is inclined to do. And being a part of the democratic process is not something I think that everyone has the opportunity to flex those muscles and exercise those muscles. And I think that's where unions, and I'm going to actually say not even just unions, but public education have a really, really important role to play. Because again, in democracy, right, you have different opportunities to participate, but if you're not regularly participating in those opportunities, you may not identify yourself, not even just as a worker, but as a person who has active power to be able to participate. And that's why your vote is so important in first place too, and to bring that worker perspective. So I'm talking about schools where we're talking about democratic institutions like school site councils, or going to school committees, or participating in school committees meetings, and having your voice heard there. And I think that's where we start building that identity, is that when we're coming into a lot of these spaces, we're coming in, as a teacher union member that's speaking up for our students and fighting for something important for our schools and communities. And that's how we start building that identity. And then we bring it into other places. And so again, I think that's why public education has been attacked so much, and particularly teachers unions in the labor movement, is because we do exercise a lot of those democratic principles and help our members in our union meetings too, right? Our union elections mirror real elections, right? Our our membership meetings. And again, to Jake's point, I think it varies, but depending on which union and the leadership, et cetera. But in general, we have these practices that are ingrained that help not only to build the identity as a worker, but to build our identity as participants in an active democracy. And that is everywhere, from the school building to our membership meetings to our larger union elections. They really do mirror our larger democratic processes. And that's how we engage our voters, and I think the worker identity, the union identity, but democracy in general. And that helps us to activate and really, I think, have power, because that's what it's all about, is building union power.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Jake and Jessica have said, and I don't want to repeat anything. Maybe I'll give a couple of examples as to bring this to light. How we talk about politics in our union is it's part of a continuous cycle, that like we win elections to pass policy to grow the union and build power for workers, so that we can elect more pro-worker champions and pass policy, and it's a continuum. And so being in a union is about being on that continuum of how we build power and change the lives for workers. And a couple of examples that came into my mind as Jake and Jessica were talking about is one of the roundtables that we did last year when we were listening to our members was we're organizing Starbucks workers. And so we did a couple of roundtables with Starbucks workers, which are young voters, which we all know in this election are not as engaged and are a very important voting bloc in this election, that have not been, seeing this election as something that will change their lives. And that's what we heard in the roundtables as well, is that it was very hard to convince these workers that voting would make an impact on their lives and change their lives, until we said about getting involved in the union, right? So the only thing that they saw as an agent of change for their lives was to organize, be a part of a union that could then exercise collective power, and then pass policy, right, and change their lives, which I think is, that's what unions are about. It's about organizing collective power, and that elections are the same thing as organizing collective power. And so I thought that roundtable was fascinating. And I think that, we also see in this moment that I like to say labor is experiencing its, cool kid on campus time, right? Like we're more popular than we've been since the 60s. And that's and that's not about us, right? Like as much as we want to say it's about us, it's about workers coming together to enact change. And so I think making that connection for workers and for voters is really important.
That's so fascinating. I really thank you for sharing that about the Starbucks workers. And Jake, I wonder if you have anything you want to add in this conversation, especially about sort of what Caitlin just said about the experience of union membership, which is about democracy acting collectively, sort of sometimes it's about voting on either for representation or for collective bargaining agreement, and then how that translates into those same kinds of activities that you hope citizens do in the political sphere.
Exactly. So that's likely one mechanism of sort of socialization of union members is this democracy in the workplace translation, translation into sort of democracy writ large. So that's actually probably a crucial mechanism. All this is very hard to study because there's all types of reasons people join labor unions or collectively, experience a, push for collectively bargained contract or go through a strike or whatnot, and have friends and family who are related to them and through their union membership and things like that. All that stuff is really crucial. So I think both the workplace democracy that both Jessica and Caitlin mentioned, and then in addition, sort of thinking about solidarity across different types of workers. So I think it is right to point to currently in the labor movement, a lot of energy coming out of young, often Gen Z workers in Starbucks, Amazon, and so forth, fighting against continued deindustrialization of unionized industries that has meant even this energy has essentially only like plateaued overall labor union membership, but still that energy is a real force. And I think an ultimate quest for a, healthy democracy is can there be solidarity between the sort of non-binary, dyed-haired Starbucks barista worker who is socially very left, right, on issues of LGBT rights, reproductive rights, religiosity, climate, and so forth, with a more, I guess, traditional, older, for example, white guy in the trades who is much more socially conservative, that the fact that there can be some solidarity across those types of individuals and social identity preferences is a really powerful thing. And I think in general, leadership really does matter. So in the Obama era, this was an era where the AFL-CIO took an explicit anti-racism push during Obama's candidacy, especially in 2008, where the leadership really signaled this. This is a moment where Richard Trumka, the then president of the AFL-CIO, is literally on speeches to the rank and file and nationally in general saying, I have heard from some of our workers that they don't want to vote for a Black candidate. And let me tell you about how racism divides the working class and so forth, which has been a sort of argument through W.E.B. Du Bois and really an existential sort of democracy-related argument is that racism divides workers in thinking about labor and democracy. But in general, these are tough slogs. It's really crucial to continue this sort of work when and leaders make different decisions. And I would say the current effect of being a Teamsters member from signals of the leadership around where you should fall within political coalitions in American democracy is very different right now than 2008 AFL-CIO signals from leadership, and that those things matter. And those things over the long term have tough to detect effects. But both of those are crucial, thinking about workplace democracy, thinking about engaging young workers across with sort of older union members in, for example, traditional private sector unions and things like that, that have historically been more conservative. All of that is a tough slot. So this is why Caitlin and Jessica's jobs are very tough. These are real, this is real hard work. And I say to all my students who want to be organizers and stuff, this is real work, and it's not about you winning an argument or feeling or dunking on somebody or feeling right. This is about the long work of socialization together as a labor movement and across lines and across differences and preferences for social policies and preferences around culture and identity that are over the long term really matter for the stability of a democracy, especially one under strain like the U.S. The last little point I'll make that was so on point by Caitlin and Jessica is talking about down ballot races, primary elections. The U.S. system of federalism makes very obscure, weird elections really important. And a general election for president, probably there's less influence to have because people know more about where they stand. The candidates are pretty clear. in their differences, but in down ballot races and primary elections that determine what parties sort of do in their overall policy agenda, that is absolutely crucial. Those tend to be low turnout elections, and organizations, particularly labor unions, have an important role in those types of elections.
Great, thank you. Again, so much to think about. I'm going to pick up on some things that I think, Caitlin, I think you probably raised it most directly, but it feels like is in this conversation. And I think at this point, this is just a fact. And Ash Center, I think, has done some programming on this. There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, particularly in this cycle, although that's obviously always a factor. Again, Caitlin and Jessica, what are some strategies that, what does the union see as their role in sort of dealing with that dynamic, and what are strategies that your unions are using to address that problem, especially when it's become so dominant in the conversation lately?
Yeah, I
Caitlin,
think
you want
this,
to go first?
sure. I mean, this is definitely a challenge in our current day and age. And I think will only get harder with AI technologies. And really, it comes down to people need trusted messengers. And that's the role of the union, right? Is that to be that trusted messenger to break through the noise of disinformation and misinformation. Because, I mean, you see this with how what people talk about this election, right? Is like not trusting the media, not trusting information that's coming at them. And so people are looking for where they can get information that they can trust. And we try to fill that void for our members and for our community members that our members are in, right? That union members are trusted messengers. The union is a trusted messenger. And we partner with many partner groups in states and in communities who are also seen as trusted messengers for their communities. And so really making sure that we have those trusted messengers throughout the states, throughout the communities to be able to break through that noise, I think is critically important. I don't know, Jessica, if you want to expand on that.
I was going to say something very, very similar. I think it does come down to trust. I mean, that's what organizational or relationship building or organizing is really all about, or relational organizing. I kind of flipped it. I mean, when we are, I mean, I was glad I was in New Hampshire, and there was a member, and like I mentioned, they I talked to actually a bunch of AFT members in New Hampshire and door knocking, and they don't, who do you trust in this day and age, right? Because everything you read or watch on TV kind of contradicts itself. And so ultimately, if you have to break through, it's who do you trust? And I think, going back to one of the prior questions, when we're working on contract campaigns together, when we're solving problems together at our school sites or our work sites, that's where we're building trust, because we're working together and trusting each other to solve these problems or negotiate contracts, or make decisions together. And so if we're building trust within our union and that union identity, then we can then be a better messenger sometimes to cut through some of the noise, to say, to the one member I mentioned was like, oh yeah, I heard I heard from my ex-husband that Harris and Walls are not pro-union. And I was like, whoa, 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 let's pause there, because that's just not true. And then I can share examples of how they've actually demonstrated that they are very pro labor, pro-union. But she had to hear it from me. I think someone I've known for a very long time, to kind of cut through other relationships where she might also generally trust them too. And so I think that's, again, why we have a really important role to play. And in general, I think teachers, again, people tend to trust teachers. And so we are a good messenger, because, that's, I think, inherent in our job, is that we need our families to trust us and other community members to trust us. And when we are out there fighting for better schools and communities, it helps to build that trust too. And so I think that's another piece of it, but totally agree with what Caitlin shared as well.
Jake, I don't know if you want to add anything about what you've seen in your research, or.
Happy to, the questions and Q&A look great too.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to pause, but.
Sure. So one thing I feel like we sort of have to confront, at least if you believe the media, there's a lot that's been written and discussed about fissures in the labor movement, about who members are likely to vote for. How do your unions, your members, how do you deal with that dynamic, about partisan splits? I mean, again, we've talked about sort of solidarity. A union is about solidarity. How do you maintain solidarity when members may fall into the same sort of partisan polarization that we see throughout our country today? Caitlin, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a very real issue. About 25% of our union is Republican or conservative leaning, and we represent all of our members. But the thing that is uniting for all of our members is union issues, right? The fact that people want a better benefits, respect, dignity on the job, higher wages, corporations held accountable, all of those things unite all of our members across party line. And that's why we lead our elections with issues, right? That this is about not about candidates and what party they belong to. It's about what if they're a pro-worker candidate or not. Oftentimes more Democrats are pro-worker than Republicans. But that we don't say we are, we support Democrats. We say we support candidates that are pro-worker. And that's very important to have that orientation to politics. And I would say, I will add that, we are also a very, aggressive social justice organization as well. And, that is part of our theory on how you have economic justice, that we don't believe that you can have economic justice without racial justice. And that in order for all of us to thrive, it needs to be all of us, and that we need to be able to bring up those that are disenfranchised the most to make sure that, we are building a better economy for everybody.
Yeah, I again, I have similar approach too. I mean, it's about the issues, right? And we always say it's not about the party, it's about the issues. And we have actually endorsed Republicans actually too. And I'll point that out. And we've actually not endorsed some Democratic candidates, for example, that were supported by Democrats for Education Reform. And so what I point to oftentimes is that, it's not about the party lines. It's really about their policy positions. And if we believe in the right to collectively bargain, who's supporting the right to collectively bargain? If we believe in the issues, and again, we also, poll our members and listen to our members, or what are the issues that are important to you? Well, if it's economics, if it's healthcare, if it's housing, if it's reproductive rights, then here are the candidates who support those positions and are aligned with us, regardless of party. And then, sometimes I share my own personal story too. I was unenrolled actually, until I became president of the Boston Teachers Union. And I did enroll as a Democrat because in Massachusetts, that's the party in power. And, that's,
The action is
be in those spaces, right? And I need to do what I need to do for my members. But again, I'll go back and say that, at the end of the day, Dems do actually tend to have more of the positions that we're looking for in our labor unions. And so doesn't mean we're always going to, represent every Dem and or not to give a Republican an opportunity to share their perspectives. But again, it comes down to the issues. I also just noticed the Q&A too, and so I'm going to pause there to make sure we have some time for some of those questions, as Jake mentioned.
And I think there's a great question in the Q&A that's really relevant to something that came out in both your answers, which is the difference. Is there a difference in either how you talk about or the receptivity of your members when the union is talking about economic issues versus social issues? I mean, Caitlin, you suggested, and certainly been my experience with working with SEIU, that there's the union moves pretty fluidly between those different kinds of issues, but I'm just wondering, are there different strategies that you bring to sort of crossing that line between what's considered an economic issue and what's considered more of like a social, a cultural issue?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tension. within our labor unions, if I'm, totally being candid and honest. I mean, we have done a lot of work, for example, at the Boston Teachers Union around housing. And I have gotten pushback from some of my members about like, why are we engaged in, housing advocacy? And how is that related to our bread and butter issues of, collective bargaining for our contracts? And, why are we using any of our collective power around those common good issues? And, what I say is actually housing impacts our paraprofessionals and a lot of our lower paid members. We've had paraprofessionals who are not making a living wage and have actually been housing insecure or living out of their cars. And also, if we are advocating, on purely like a self-interested perspective, I guess, if we don't have students, we're not going to have jobs, right? And so if it's not, just because we believe actually that our students deserve stable housing in order to do well for, and do well in school, if we're not helping our students get housing and have families in our neighborhoods, we are not going to have any enrollment. If we don't have any enrollment, then it actually hurts us economically as well too. And so I think there's many angles to this, but it is a conversation that has to be had because we don't always naturally see, how, what does reproductive health have to do with teachers unions? Well, we're a majority woman union, and actually it does impact our members. Or, why are we fighting for racial justice? Well, there actually are a lot of implications in how racism is impacting our economics, whether it's through, institutional racism, funding for schools, et cetera. And so I think, again, that is one of the important roles that our union plays of helping to connect the dots of how those social issues actually are economic issues and how they are actually labor issues too.
Can I take or Caitlin, where you going?
I was literally going to say that I could not answer it better than what Jessica said.
Yeah, no, I think that was a great answer. And I think like Jessica speaks to, often there are particular labor issues that intersect or involve these, what we consider like social issues. So, their labor unions fight against managerial harassment that's often like gendered and sexual, fight for, birth control being provided within employer-based health insurance. These hit people's different, and this is often unions as small d democratic organizations follow rank and file preferences often on those issues. So, Jessica's examples about reproductive rights or housing are really on point here. And it takes a sort of majority rank and file push from the union to set those issues. Sarah Nelson and the flight attendants union they do work on reproductive rights in, again, a majority women-based union. There are issues in general when we think about socialization and attitude formation in politics. When people change their mind on an issue like, legal abortion or something as deep and often like tied to religious belief and things like that, is that it's not because they're convinced by like new facts and information, but it's about socialization within community, for example, around your fellow workers and union members. And you, over the long term, say, oh, this person, I don't like that other political party, but this, my coworker, we've been together in pushes for better contracts and wages and benefits. They are from the other party, believe this other social issue position than I do. And you soften to that issue rather than are converted by like facts and figures about, oh, like banning abortion harms women is not going to convince you, but rather being part of something bigger than yourself with people who have different preferences on that really matters. So unions are one of the last, civil society has really diminished in the US over the past couple of generations through technology, economic change. People are way more atomized and on smartphones and things like that. Unions are a place where people can, once again, like across various forms of identity and background, can engage in pulling in the same direction on something, and that can create more consensus around these other issues that are not directly advocated for by the union or union leadership.
Great. Jack, I have a question for you that's has come up in the chat, but happy to have anybody jump in. the relationship, there's a question that gets at this relationship between internal, like union democracy, and members' feelings about like political democracy. As you know, you came up here or you were actually joined us in a conference that we had here almost a year ago about this connection. And obviously there's two big examples in the US labor movement where there was a change in sort of internal union democracy, the Teamsters and at the UAW. Now we're seeing, I don't know if it's related, but different approaches to political democracy in those unions. I just wonder from like a research perspective, how you would think about that question. Are you looking at that? Sort of how does one inform the other? And curious also, obviously from Caitlin and Jessica, how that plays out in like your credibility with speaking to your members and being part of a democratic organization.
What an excellent question. So this has long been a puzzle of social scientists. For example, why do longshore unions on either coast that had similar sort of origins generally like took very different over the long term positions, like radically different in terms of like beliefs overall about politics and the political economy? That's just a small example from the same industry. But then you think across sectors and industries, the idea that like a public safety union for ICE or Customs and Border Patrol will be the same as SEIU or AFT in its orientation is just not going to be the case. But in general, these are battles. There are sort of small d democracy battles within unions. Unions are also federated organizations of locals that are distinct from each other too. Locals have their own political battles. There's a long-term social science question and labor question about whether contested union democracy within locals and unions overall is good for the union. Does it bring energy and like a little friction, in like a, local president's election? Does that bring more energy, or does it like turn people off and you want a more consensus-based, quieter union situation? I think the jury's still out on that, but I do think in some contested elections, it does signal more interest and things like that. Unions have also changed positions on many issues overall. So the 90s and 2000s, like even the United Farm Workers was generally against immigration and support workers' rights for undocumented workers, like through the Cesar Chavez era. And in the 2000s, like labor fundamentally in the US, like very much changed in terms of the positions both workers and union leaders saw on like undocumented workers being exploited, harming all workers by lowering the floor of exploitation in that way really changed. So I would just say these are ongoing battles. They're not easy to summarize, but I do think both the pressures from the rank and file and union leaders really both matter. And in this era, like what in explaining the Teamsters, for example, there has been in the Trump era, the Republican Party has verbally sort of tried to assert a working class sort of identity in the Trump era. During the Trump presidency and Republican Congress, the only big major national policies on the agenda were end the Affordable Care Act and a high-end tax cut. So that didn't actually translate to a policy agenda. But that does create an opening sometimes for, particularly when a union leader thinks, that is the party that's going to win office. There's something about being aligned with the winner too. That creates a different situation, and things, what do you call it? Like there's a fine line between a union's decision here, both from rank and file pressures and leadership. And I would just say we saw different positions in the Obama era around union alignment. We saw different positions in the Trump era and how rank and files and union leaders are shaking out with this. But in general, I would say even when the union leadership aligns with the Republican Party, there still is a potential opening for these union democracy effects, I would say. But in general, unions are contentious politics in general, and we're seeing that in this new era of, as Caitlin and Jessica said, record-breaking approval of labor unions, much more support for people wanting to join a labor union, highest Google searches ever on how do I form or join a labor union, capitalizing on that energy across this very diverse and heterogeneous country. That's going to have a lot of contentious politics in locals and nationally. So it's not easy to summarize.
Jessica, Caitlin, I don't know if you want to add anything to that about, does that come up in conversations with members about sort of how their perception of the quality of democracy within the union, and then how they feel about political democracy?
Sure. I tend to think that, having contested elections actually can build more engagement. I'll share that I originally ran challenging an incumbent, and I did it because I wanted to see, because my hunch was that there were a lot of members in the Boston Teachers Union that shared my belief that we really needed to focus more on moving from a service model to an organizing model, and also kind of more of a rank and file led social justice unionism model. Really, I think I looked to Chicago Teachers Union, 2012 and Karen Lewis's age, as where we needed to go. And so, and I can tell you that me running actually just doubled the amount of people who came out and voted. And that was part of my goal too, was not just to win, was just to, a lot of folks didn't even realize that a lot of the officers were elected. And so I think that in some way is a way that, again, we're exercising those democratic muscles. And the truth is, a lot of union leaders actually are elected by more people than even our state reps or senators or city councilors, depending on the size of our unions. And so, again, running, sharing your mission, your vision, your goals, and then having those conversations with other union members and engaging other union members in even your internal elections, I think does actually help build those activist, democratic participatory muscles. So I think it can be healthy, but I can certainly see how sometimes it's been divisive too. And again, I think it depends on the union and the culture and, what's historically happened there. But in general, I do find that it can engage more members.
I agree. I mean, elections are a tool for how we can have conversations around issues, and, we have a very diverse membership. We represent three sectors: our public sector, our healthcare sector, and property services. And they are very different groupings of people. And, one of the most impactful things that I have seen around elections is when we bring them together, when we bring our members across sector together. And so I can remember when I was a political director of a local in Florida, one of our public sector members who was very active in the union, conservative, and very against our political agenda. When he was in a leadership academy with one of our nursing home CNAs, his political ideology completely changed and suddenly became an active participant in our political program because he thought that the disrespect that the CNAs were receiving, majority Black and brown women, was so atrocious that he wanted to help them. And so I think that they're a great opportunity to really, pull people together and talk about the issues.
Great, thank you both for sharing those stories. So another question in the chat is a little bit more like on the mechanics, but for folks who haven't been in unions, haven't gone through a political cycle with the labor movement, can you share just a little bit about how, like, the mechanics of how do you assess candidates, the process for making an endorsement? And then I think this is a really important part of this question. What's the follow through? Like, you're obviously, you put your time, resources, credibility, a lot of money behind a candidate. What then happens after election day if you've picked the right candidate who wins? Caitlin, you want to?
Sure.
I've been on the receiving end of some of that, so from SEIU, so I have a little insight, but.
The process is very lengthy. It's very involved. I think there's always a running joke about how long it takes unions to move. But that's because it's really important on where we put our resources, right? These are resources from working people, and we want to make smart decisions, and we're a democracy, and we want to make we want our members to make the decisions, and so. Our process, we have both a policy process in terms of having candidates fill out questionnaires and any kind of issue pledges that we have in that moment. But we also have member screenings, right? So every candidate needs to be screened by our members in their district. And the members need to decide and make the recommendation on who do we endorse. Now, part of that is having a conversation with our members that has to look into many factors, right? Where does this candidate stand on our agenda? What is their ability to win? Sometimes those two things don't match. And so we have to have those kind of conversations with our members. But ultimately, we want our members to be the ones that are interfacing with candidates and making the decision on who we endorse. Because then they'll be the ones in the streets that have to knock on the doors and hold that candidate accountable. And then after election day, it's a, hopefully if everything is done right, they deliver on the agenda that we went into the election with. And I think one of the things that we've learned is it's really important to go into the election with a clear agenda so that candidates know, why we are involved in this election, that working people are really expecting them to deliver on some things, and making sure that that's clear and sharp, because if it's not clear and sharp, then there's a lot of wiggle room.
Jessica, you want to share anything about how mass AFT makes endorsement decisions, and then whatever, anything you want to add about at the national level, AFT's process?
Sure. I mean, the national level, I think it's a similar process. There's a lot of polling that happens, figuring out where members are on different issues. And I think that's part of the solution also, going back up to the other question about sometimes when you have contested elections, how do you bring people back together? Well, you bring people back together, by reaching across the aisle, and also, there's a leadership piece to this, to unifying people even after a contested election. But similarly, when we have divided ideas in our membership, finding the common ground and getting that information and hearing from our members and polling does inform, I think, what positions and what we want to prioritize in terms of our candidate endorsement process, et cetera. And so, at AFT Massachusetts, we're actually trying to refigure that out, actually. We've relied on voting history in the past. We've relied on AFL-CIO questionnaires in the past. But I think that we could actually even revamp our endorsement process a little bit more, and thinking about what other factors we're looking at, if we want to have our own questionnaires, if we want to, do we just endorse incumbents that, have voted on the right side of issues, or do we want to put more energy and resources to specific candidates who not just vote right, but actually actively are fighting for and helping us to win legislation? I mean, I think these are all questions that we grapple with, is, what is the right endorsement process, and how do we engage our members? But then also, do we just go with who we think is going to win, or do we want to run our own candidates? And even if we don't win, then who do we support? But, there's fallout too when your candidate you don't win, or that you're supporting doesn't win, right? And so these are exactly the kind of difficult political decisions we have to make. But the one thing, again, I like to lean on is our members. But I have to say this too, is, all of our unions are not monolithic. Some unions tend to have more democratic processes than others. I find that in general, public sector unions tend to be a little bit more democratic because we don't get to choose our members. We're not like the building trades, for example, where they determine who gets a job, and there are real repercussions, and it's kind of a different kind of power dynamic internally than public sector unions, where, you have a constituency that you have to be reelected to. There are different dynamics within different unions, and I think that factors also into some of these decisions as well, and how endorsements work. we are not top down. I'm not like, hey, board, here's who we're going to endorse. There's a collective process, a COPE committee. Our COPE committee interviews our candidates. They make a recommendation. The BTU has to be 2/3 of the COPE, 2/3 of the executive board, and then 2/3 of our membership. And that's a pretty high standard. And so, yeah, I think, again, it depends on which union, but I can share that BTU and AFT, that's how our process works.
Great. Thank you. So just to like summarize, it's like it is a democratic process to decide how to engage in the democratic process. All right, we are just at time. The time just flew by. Again, I have to just thank our panel so much. This is such a crazy busy time, and to take time to sort of talk both about what you're doing in this cycle, but some of these deeper questions about the role of the labor movement, something that we're really interested in working with our colleagues, the Ash Center on. And so again, thank you, everybody. Make your plan to vote.